Good evening. Good evening with some delay of nearly 20 minutes. We will start the opening ceremony. My name is Apostolos Papadopoulos. I am chair of the local organizing committee, and I would like to say that we are delighted to have you here tonight in the opening ceremony. And we will start the ceremony by inviting first Mr. Kretsos, who is the General Secretary of for Media and Communication, the Ministry of Digital Policy, Telecommunications and Media, to have a welcome address. Mr. Kretsos.
So, good evening, everybody. Dear members of the organizing committee, distinguished speakers, critical thinkers, critical theorists, conference participants, colleagues, and friends. It's a great honor for me to welcome you in Athens for the 13th conference of the European Sociological Association. As I was preparing my notes for this welcome speech, I just remember myself when I was young student in the area of social policy, but I also remember myself as a master's student, as a PhD student. All those things took place sometime mid-90s, and I remember very well on that time that it was a period of major transformations across Europe, in the society as a whole, but it was also a period of major transformations across the academic environment, universities, research centers alike. So it was a period of relative prosperity for most European Union countries, including Greece, including Ireland, including Spain. It was a period of relative prosperity for what we know as the European Union, that on that time it was refined, it was expanded, both in geographical but also in institutional terms. And the recurring idea of those days was that we need more and more Europe. So what this Europe of which we needed more and more, that was a mystery to many, and especially to those that were in greater need, of course. So in what concerns social, academic, and scientific debates, all those debates were clustered about buzzwords, as it usually happens with the way media operates, and a lot of catchphrases such as the so-called end of history, the so-called end of work, all those latest theories about globalization and its repercussions for the economy and the society, and so on. And all those ideas and debates were taking place amidst a rapidly changing academia, where its main elements was the marketization of universities, the cutting down of public spending, especially for social sciences departments, new public management and managerialism, the revenge of Thatcherism across the education, the expansion of a new paradigm in academia, several elements of which, unfortunately, were incorporated into the Bologna process and declaration, a process that, of course, did harmonize the architecture of the European higher education system at a significant cost, though, for intellectual life and academic freedom. So what we were facing on that time, of course, younger people were more frustrated with the situation, not other segments of the workforce that were more or less more protected than the others, but what we were facing on that time was the establishment, step by step, of the neoliberal paradigm. It's been almost 2 decades since that period, and here we are today, junior, senior sociologists, distinguished speakers, gathered together in my city, in Athens, and a country that I think symbolizes a lot of things, but also symbolizes, perhaps in the most exemplar way, the failure of the neoliberal paradigm. I'm saying this taking into consideration national peculiarities as well. So what we shall be debating in the following days is the unmaking on Europe, the ills and opportunities of late capitalism and the perspectives towards a better future for sociology, your profession, and our societies alike. And admittedly, this debate is not only timely or even urgent, but also increasingly complex. Complex in a Europe that faces the Brexit challenge, the rise of nationalism, the dismantling of the social base in countries such as Greece that have been ravaged by years of austerity. The impact, of course, of climate change, as well as other more ambiguous and multifaceted developments such as the rise of algorithm-based communication and economy, the use of big data to interpret, sometimes manipulate and predict human behavior, and so on. So if we are here to re-establish sociology as a necessary scientific tool for contemporary societies, and of course the policymakers, we need to revisit its founders' reasoning on why people should continue practicing the discipline in the first place, identify social problems, explain them, suggest applicable solutions to resolve them. Rephrasing Marx, most sociologists have only attempted to interpret the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And change, of course, is not an convenient and easy situation. So I'm confident that many among the numerous keynote speeches, roundtables, presentations that will be held in the upcoming days will serve the above purpose. So given this, I would like just to thank you again, to welcome you in Athens, and to wish to the conference participants, and especially to the organizers, that I would really like to thank them. Some of them used to teach me the elements of sociological theory, and I feel really, really happy about that. So I wish you every success in the conference. Thank you very much.
I would like to briefly address the welcome speech on the part of the local organizing committee. So, I would say, dear distinguished guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, dear colleagues, today is the day of the opening of this great conference, a conference that we have been preparing for the last 2 years. We are delighted to announce the opening of the conference and of this unique European event for the social sciences. As a local organizing committee, we are very proud to host this European Sociological Conference, the 13th, with a theme that strikes right at the heart of current discussions over the sustainability of a common European future. The sub-theme especially, with its triad of concepts, signifies an interaction of forces that will define the future of Europe and its peoples. The message of the conference, which is making or unmaking Europe, is loud and clear, and it has been widely communicated through our means of communication with the wider society. The message of the conference theme is conveyed excellently by organizing this event in Greece, in Athens, Greece, which has been the main referent of the 2009 financial crisis and the European crisis bound together. Therefore, this conference states the urgent need to discuss in depth not simply the nuts and bolts of the multiple crises and their implications for the European citizens, but more importantly to explore the options and drivers connected to the remaking of the so-called European project. As sociologists, we know that this remaking contains many connotations, many smaller and larger processes, and various angles of interpretation. It has been a brave move to take the responsibility of organizing this conference in Greece. By doing so, we manifested our intention to force academia and the public and the wider public in Greece into an informed dialogue over Europe and the quest for democratic solutions. The strengthening of sociology as discipline and of sociological thinking has been major concerns in a country that moans under the burden of neoliberal policies and austerity measures. Responding to the excessive pressures of recession, inequalities, political realism, so-called political realism, economic rationality and effectiveness, Greek academics and concerned citizens have often raised their claims over development, social justice, democracy, human rights, and social resilience. These are also shared by many academics and others across Europe, not only by Greeks. Despite the many challenges we faced during the preparation of this conference, we discovered that the undertaking of our common European sociological project, if we wanted to call it like that, was an exciting and rewarding experience through which many people were engaged and shared the objective of empowering sociologists and social scientists within a wider setting defined by regressive and utilitarian economic and political thinking. As we progressed with the organization of the event, we realized that there is a critical mass of people, and I mean that there is a critical mass of people with whom we shared our vision, which has been an incentive for us to excel in tasks to get a fine event to all participants and followers. The joint venue of the conference is offered by two public universities, closely collaborating for the organization of this conference. We are grateful to the rectors and staff in both universities for facilitating the success of the conference. Greek public universities have been severely affected by the financial crisis and the austerity measures imposed to the country. The universities have been always, in Greece as far as elsewhere, in the avant-garde of its progressive ideological and political movement in the country. During the years of recession, and there have been many, universities have felt the negative impact of underfinancing, but in many of them, members of staff, researchers and graduate students proved that they could carry out valuable research and compete not in the negative sense, at the international level with their peers. By organizing this conference, public universities have proved that they can become a regenerating force in Greece. One of the missions of academia is to contribute positively to the societal problems and challenges and point paths towards addressing and resolving these problems. A difficult task. Otherwise, the university, the academia, becomes an apathetic institution which only cares for the improvement of its members. In the midst of crisis, Greek universities were blamed for such behavior. However, all of us today are witnessing the capacities and ability of the Greek university and its members to be effective and in the organization of this highly esteemed social science event. Ladies and gentlemen, before closing this address, I would like to say that for enabling us to organize this conference, I owe special thanks to Frank Welz, the president of ESA, and Christian Fuchs, the chair of the program committee, and Dagmar Danko, and of course to all members of the executive for their collaboration. I should also say that every member of the Athens LOC has worked really hard for accomplishing the targets we set from the very beginning, but I would like to thank in particular from this podium some people, Nikos Leandros, Δέσποινα Παπαδοπούλου, Γιώργος Μαυρομάτης, Κώστας Δημουλάς, Χριστίνα Καρακιουλάθη, Σοκράτης Κονιόρδος, Λάουρα Μαράτου Αλιπράντη, Θανάσης Λακρεντής, Νίκος Κουραχάνης, Λουκία Μαρία Φρατσέα, Αλέκα Θεοφίλη, Αλίκη Φιδετζή, Στέλιος Τατάκης και Δημήτρης Φραγκουλάκης, for all the hard work to ensure the success of the conference. Our project, the sociological project, would not materialize without the assistance of over 250 volunteers from 5 universities. I would like to express my warm welcome to each and every one of you to this, the 13th European Sociological Association Conference in Athens, and wish you all a fruitful attendance and pleasant stay in Athens during the next 3 days. Thank you all for being here in this opening ceremony. Now, I would like to call onto the podium Frank Welz, the President of EHESS, to introduce you to the conference. Thank you.
Dear Mr. Kretsos, dear Apostolos, dear invited speakers, David Harvey and Eva Illouz, and dear sociologists, 3,600 sociologists from 77 countries. We appreciate very much that you join the community of sociologists here in Athens. I'm extremely delighted and really glad. You cannot imagine how glad I am that now it starts and it really works, because our collaboration since 1 year was very, very challenging. So I'm really so happy to be here. For me, in Greece, as for all of us probably, questioning reality, this began in Greece. Putting reality into question, thinking, according to the philosopher Edmund Husserl, possibly you call him Husserl, yeah? 80 years ago, he wrote about the crisis of thinking, the crisis of human beings in Europe, the crisis of thinking. And he said, thought, thinking, reason originated in Greece. And now in the 30s, 1935, when he wrote about this, he said, thinking is in a very deep crisis, very severe crisis, thinking. We forgot our roots. We forgot where does thinking come from. Yeah? No, of course, not in a geographic sense. So I relate this to Greece, and now we are here. So I'm extremely happy to be here, and you also. I have 3 parts now. My speech has 3 parts. First, intellectual part. Second, social part. And third, heavy part. Start with the first thing, with the intellectual thing. Now I lost my slideshow. Okay, I start first intellectual part. I call it sociology first. I start with the conference theme. As you see here, in 1999, in our ESA conferences, we started our conferences in, I think, in 92, 99. The topic was, will Europe work? We asked this question. In 2011, we talked about turbulent times. In 2013, we focused on the crisis. And now, 4 years after, we talk about unmaking, you know. My point of view, it's a clear development, and as always in history, the dialectics of enlightenment goes in the wrong direction. This is what I see here in the themes. What I also learned and what I experienced with our current conference theme. When we proposed this theme in the governing board of the ESA to 16 people, it was very interesting, because I shared this discussion 2 times ago, before also, and usually there are long discussions and this theme, that theme, 3 votes here, 4 votes there. But with this theme, it was announced, Unmaking Europe, Capitalism, Solidarities, Subjectivities. It was announced, and immediately all people said, that's a theme, that is a theme, nothing else. Yeah. And the only thing they said, this group said, one term was missing, and they said solidarities must be there. So the only change was at solidarities, and I will soon return to that. I thought, why they are so enthusiastic with this conference theme? I think it's the following. after the Great Recession of 2008-9 and all this crisis in Europe, the over-reliance on capitalism that we feel outside here, the austerity measures that are applied to so many countries and to so big parts of the population, and the evaporating solidarities, the shrinking solidarities in Europe between countries, between labor unions in this country and that country, shrinking solidarities, all these things coincide so very much in Greece. So I think the conference theme, how we conceive it, and also the location, this fits together, and we are excited to come here and to discuss these questions. And the second thing what I see in this conference theme, we don't call it debt crisis or financial crisis, we call it making or unmaking. We are sociologists, we see a process. We don't blame anyone, we see a process. So I think it's very good, it's a relational world that we see, a process. And then of course capitalism. The ESA has never had the wording, the term capitalism in its conference headline. Now it's back. Why is it back? Because I agree to it very much. Because we look behind the curtain. We're not blaming people and blaming any causes. We think, how does all this operate? How does this work? You know, and then capitalism is the first candidate to be discussed, capitalism. Now only two words are missing. This is solidarities and subjectivities. Solidarities, as I told you, people claimed, solidarities are missing. Solidarity, we stand together, we change Europe, let's change it. Solidarities are very important. And now I know this very well. I'm sure you will also like it. Solidarities, and when I remember the ISA conference last year in Vienna, organized by Margaret Abraham, I suppose she is also here, possibly there. And then Markus Schulz, they organized this, they had this conference themes, the futures we want. And I know from Vienna, people were excited. This is what sociologists like, you know, they like to stand together to change the world, the futures we want. We are solidarical, we are solidarical with other countries, with the marginalized. This is the future we want. We should, sociology on the move, we should change. Yeah. So I understand this very well. And I will soon return to this in a very, my point of view, interesting way. Now I come to subjectivities. I was very much involved in Brussels, advocacy for social science. Yeah. And now you should definitely read it, the new so-called high caliber Lamy report, because of the director of this team, Lamy. They have a new report, and I show you here the cover of this new report, the Lamy report on the future of sciences in Europe and the research funding, the next framework programs, research funding, the advices. What do they say? So, look, sociologists said the futures we want. And what do they say in Brussels in research funding? They say the same. The future we want. Yeah? But how do they interpret it? They say investing, innovation, yeah? New products to sell them on the market, investing in the European future we want. So what I'm trying to say with this is that these subjectivities, the term subjectivities, I think it's not like, as we saw it in the 60s, 70s, that there is a bad world of the systemic world of capitalism, and here we are, the future we want, and we change it. The challenging thing is that these subjects that resist, that we want, that change, that we are also governed, as Foucault described, the governed subjectivities. There's a social governance, and we are also part of this game. And now when we apply for research funding to Brussels, when we are under research assessment in universities, when we have to climb up the career ladder in our system of work, then all this world makes us and imposes on us, as Foucault described, and I think this is a new thing now, that we should become entrepreneurs of ourselves. Yeah. So we are self-entrepreneurs to get a higher Hirsch index, to have Google Scholar quotations and all that thing. So I think it's not our subjectivities, and therefore this is the term subjectivity. It's not so easy that here's a bad world and now here we are, there's solidarity and here we are, but also we are also part of this. And this is, makes the thing very, very difficult. Yeah? How can we change the world when we are very deep anchored in this world? So this is my consideration of the conference theme. Now I come shortly to sociology. What can we do in that, and why I'm so much subscribing to sociology? Sociology is, for me, it's not just about what is sociology. It's about society, family, groups. No, 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 no. Sociology is a mode of thinking, possibly the mode of thinking that originated in Greece. You know, it's putting the reality into question. And what we are saying when we talk about this great recession, we are not saying banking crisis, Wall Street, bail out the banks, and 2 years after we say too much bailout, now you have too much debt crisis, or very bad work ethic in Europe, in some countries, or migrants are the cause. This is not what we are doing. We are relating things. This is a talk in the media. Bad guy here, bad guy there, debt crisis, banking crisis, migration, yeah, many problems. We are relating things to each other. We are trying to understand the world and improve life. And one example here, what are sociologists doing with this crisis that is behind this curtain? Of course, on the one hand, we have extreme intra-societal inequalities, which are only topped by inter-societal imbalances. When we think about Greece, we are not saying, there are problems in policy in Greece, in Athens, or this minister, that minister, yeah, or anything like that. We think these things are related to each other. Yeah? We think there's not, we say, there's too much, it was too much import in Greece, they imported too much. We know if there's import, there's export. Yeah? We also know if there's debt, so bad, so much debt. But then there's so much savings. There are so many rich. You know, this is related. So when we think about what is the situation of Greece, why is it so bad, you know, we should look to the bigger picture. We are relational thinkers. We have a mode of thinking. We apply a method on reality. And our method is relating things to each other. And for instance, we claim the social. And now, just this slide. The target inflation rate in Europe has been agreed on 1.9%. The only country very often blamed as so bad, you know, too less flexibility on the labor market. France is the only country who applied to this agreed inflation rate. In their wages per this is a table that shows real unit labor costs. France applies to this. The costs of labor were increasing in Greece and Italy, and in Germany, and this is my point, usually the media say, at least in my language world, which is a German language world in Austria, yeah, the media are saying, Germany, world champion in export, so much export, they do so good. Why do the others also not export so much? Sociologists know the world economic system would not work if 77 countries where you come from, all of them are export champions. Can it work that all are export champions? Can all people be in debt? No, there must be another side. Yeah? So if Germany is so much exporting, why can they so much import? Look to their wages. They agreed on 2%, and they have wage dumping since the early 2000 years. So, and then you cannot compete with this. So when I look to this, possibly I should not look to this, I think this European crisis is unsolvable when you look to this. You cannot change things here. This is related to what is happening in other countries. So this is for me relational thinking. We are looking to the social. Yeah? Unlike the world is doing, the media are doing, we look to the behind the curtain and we discuss this social. This is now I come to the social, to my second part, the social. Because of that, because we have a very good method of thinking, analyze things, delete common sense understanding, as Pierre Bourdieu said, and construct the world in a new sense, give the world a new meaning. Let's understand the world. Yeah, this is what we have, but it's not visible so much in public. So we have to come together, we have to stand together and to discuss now in this meeting, how can we develop our voice and how can we improve also our understanding of the world. We are doing this here, of course. And what we are doing in this conference, now I talk about this social dimension of our conference here. We have plenaries, now the very first plenary. In the plenaries, today, tomorrow evening, in semi-plenaries, we try very much to touch this main topic. Yeah, because we like to ask a question, the conference has a question, and the plenaries and semi-plenaries are there for offering an answer. Not one answer, but we ask question and try to find an answer. So this is very much focused. In our semi-plenaries, it's the first time in ESA that you were invited to submit a paper even to the stage, to the semi-plenary. So we try to invite. Yeah? And this increased participation from non-native speaking countries to be invited to come to submit papers to the semi-plenaries. And third, the most important, the leg or the food of all our activities. This is of course not the plenaries, but the research network sessions. I think we have nearly 800 network sessions where you present your paper. We have 2,900 presentations, so enough to find one for you. In these paper sessions where you present, my advice is for the young scholar, when you're here the very first time, when you are a PhD student, when I remember back when I was sitting here the first time, I thought, oh my God, I'm very young sociologist and they are senior scholars, they talk to each other and I don't matter, yeah. But my advice is, it looks as if they know each other so very well, but they also only meet once in 2 years or once in 4 years. They are not so, it's a very open world here, you know, possibly you don't feel like that, but it's very open, very open. It's a flat organization. It's open to everyone. We have elections, we replace people, yeah. And my advice is for you, it's very, very good. These research networks on family, industrial relations, gender, religion, yeah, all of them have a business meeting. It's announced, scheduled for Thursday evening. And all of you are invited. You must not register. You are invited. You can just go there. And my advice is go there. Yeah? Most often they are lacking board members. You immediately become a board member. You cannot believe, but it happens like that. And when you are there, they know you. When you apply next time to the conference, they think, his abstract is could be improved, but we know him. Yeah, I mean, it's very good. My advice is, go to the business meeting and join them, become familiar with others. It's also refreshing and great fun. Social dimension. Now I come to my third part. My third part is, the heavy part. Yeah, I was traveling from Austria and I had brought two very heavy bags with me, and this is for our collaboration with the local organizing committee. Earlier, when I thought about Greece, when I read books and discussed in sociology, social theory, philosophy, I think Greece has been for me Socrates and Aristotle. Yeah, not so much for me, not so much Plato, but Aristotle. Socrates, Aristotle. But now it completely changed. For me now, when I see Greece on the map, well, then I think Socrates and Apostolos. This is a new meaning. Socrates and Apostolos. Socrates has been the chairperson of the Hellenic Sociological Society 1 year ago. He was introducing this conference to Greece. But since 1 year, Apostolos took over. We became good friends. We have a very intense, we often call each other because you cannot solve these things by email. And so for me, it's now Socrates and Apostolos. And the first person I would like really to thank on behalf of our, not alone, but on behalf of our governing board, and possibly also on behalf of all of you, of the European Sociological Association, I thank very much Apostolos as a chairperson of all what is happening here, in these 3 locations here. Yeah, Apostolos, thank you very much, and I would like to make my package less heavy. And another person from here, they are also in close collaboration, is Thanasis. Yeah? So I would also like to ask Thanasis that we can thank him, because he was... He was day and night available for us. Unbelievable, yeah? I don't know when this man is sleeping. And also, of course, I know that as you all of us know, behind him, he had a colleague, and there are many people behind, but I cannot mention all names because of time, and also because I don't know all names. Yeah, so I'm thanking him, but he was the person to whom I called. Yeah, and then of course people who give their permission, who open their doors, and who helped a lot with personal work and energy. This is the rectors of both university, Professor Ismini Kriari. I would also like to thank her. I also have a present for her. Ah, she is here. And I think I also brought another thing for Professor Maria Nicolaidou, but I think she broke her. She's not here. She's here. But okay. So, and now only 3 more, then it's done, yeah. And we as you know, we reorganized the conference operations. It's not the abstract submission, the registration for 3,500 people. And I tell you, in the month of May, just in 1 month, 2,800 people registered. And as you can imagine, they write, why is my paper on Friday? I would prefer to talk on Wednesday. And so, and people behind the ESA who replied to that, who know these names very well, I would like to show them to you who are the faces behind the ESA operations in Paris, and also who worked much beyond the expectations, because the conference developed such a pressure and it's unavoidable, and then they were there. We have 2 employees and an intern, and I would like to call them together and also thank them. And the first one is Dagmar Danko, the coordinator of ESA. And Andrea Batista Diaz, our second employee. Andrea Batista and Veronica Riedel, our intern. She worked 5 months in our office. Thank you very much.
So now we go to the next part, to the opening plenary. I will call on the podium and in the Christian Fuchs from the University of Westminster, who is going to chair the next session. Please, Professor Fuchs. And also David Harvey from City University of New York, who's a plenary speaker, and Eva Illouz from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the second plenary speaker. Give them an applause.
All right, so welcome everyone to this plenary session under the title Making and Unmaking Capitalism. What is this all about? In the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama commented on the breakdown of the Soviet system. He said that the end of history had come, that capitalism would exist forever. The social sciences, and I think we should partly be self-critical and reflexive there, partly followed Fukuyama's analysis by forgetting about class and capitalism. Instead, the focus was much more on categories and the analysis of phenomena such as globalization, individualization, risk, networks, modernity, identity, and so on. 25 years later, societies and sociology have changed. The notion of capitalism and the works of Karl Marx have returned in the light of capitalism's actual crisis. They've returned into public and sociological vocabulary. And by coincidence, 2017 is not just the year, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, but also the 150th anniversary of the publication of Marx Capital Volume 1. Capitalism as a type of society is making and unmaking itself. What does this mean? Economically, capitalism's contradictions are again and again unmaking social and economic stability. These contradictions are making socio-economic crisis. Contradictions have resulted in the 2008 world economic crisis that has turned into a political crisis and into a legitimacy crisis of the European Union and of other social formations. These crises have caused so much misery for so many people in the world, especially in capitalism's periphery countries, such as Greece in Europe. Spatially, capitalism is unmaking its own boundaries. It is making new milieus of accumulation and exploitation and new boundaries. Temporally, capitalism unmakes the pace of society. It makes new standards of abstract time and abstract labor. We experience the ever-increasing acceleration of life. Politically, capitalism makes and unmakes state power. The surveillance state has emerged. We experience a negative dialectic in which the neoliberal capitalist state turns against itself and against the Enlightenment values and increasingly produces the authoritarian capitalist state. Ideologically, capitalism continuously makes and remakes political fetishisms. Political fetishism today constitutes the rise of new nationalisms, new racism and xenophobia. These phenomena can be unmade by political movements that defetishize the nation. Technologically, capitalism unmakes existing standards of productivity by making new technological paradigms. As a consequence, we have seen the rise of digital capitalism and its phenomena such as social media, big data, digital labor, or the Internet of Things. At the level of the military, capitalism unmakes peace by making new forms of conflict, contradiction, and imperialism. Capitalism also unmakes the boundaries between categories such as the universal and the particular, labor and leisure, work and play, the home and the workplace, production and consumption, the public and the private, and so on. All under the logic of instrumental reason, where capitalist liquefaction produces new contradictions in our everyday lives. At the level of the subject, capitalism makes and unmakes our individual and collective identities and desires. Our subjectivities are becoming instrumentalized, controlled, and commodified. Emotional capitalism has emerged. So capitalism is a complex process of making and unmaking. The European Sociological Association has invited two of the world's leading critical theorists of capitalism for opening up this conference and enlighten our sociological understanding of capitalism. I would like to welcome David Harvey and Eva Illouz, our two speakers in the plenary session. Professor Harvey is a distinguished professor of anthropology and geography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and author of many books, articles, and lectures that have been highly influential in the development of modern geography as a discipline and the advancement of geographical and spatial analysis in Marxist and critical theory in general. He's author of many books, such as 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, The Enigma of Capital and the Crisis of Capitalism, A Companion to Marx Capital, Rebel Cities, a short history of neoliberalism, the new imperialism, and limits to capitalism. And in fact, his new book will just be published on Thursday, which has the title Marx, Capital, and the Madness of Economic Reason. Professor Illouz has been professor of sociology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem since 2006, and also a director d'études at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris since 2015. Her research focuses on how emotional life has been transformed by capitalism and by the culture of modernity. Her studies on emotions, consumer capitalism, and media cultures are regarded as major milestones in the study of social relations in the modern world. She's author of books such as Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism, Saving the Modern Soul, Therapy, Emotions, and the Culture of Self-Help, Why Love Hurts, A Sociological Explanation, and Hardcore Romance. Professor Illouz was the first woman president of Bezalel Academy of Art and Design in Jerusalem. Each of the two will speak for about 30 minutes. So Professor Harvey will start with a talk titled When Money Betrays Value, then followed by Professor Illouz's talk, also about 30 minutes, with the title Evaluation, Valuation, and Devaluation, Sexuality, and the Techno-Capitalist Self. If you want to tweet about these talks or during the conference, please use the hashtag ESA 2017 Athens. So I'm handing over to David Harvey, and yeah, I think he has a slide, but we cannot see it. I don't know if we can switch over here.
I am thrilled to be here as usual in Athens, and I'm sorry it's such a short trip this time, but things get very busy because of the 150th anniversary of the publication of Marx's Capital. So I find myself running from one place to another, and the book which has just come out is partly designed to try to situate what Marx talks about in Volume 1 of Capital against the background of the totality of how Marx was conceiving of a capitalist society and a capitalist economic system. In pursuing that mission, I decided I would like to try some visualization of Marx's Capital from the 3 volumes and his other works such as the Grundrisse and Theories of Surplus Value. And I came up with the design you see on the slide here. Now, the interesting thing about thinking about the totality of Marx's thought is that from the perspective of the totality, you start to reinterpret the parts that you know very well. And you also find yourself discovering things that you really had passed unrecognized. So when I looked at this as a relationship to the 3 bowls of capital, it then seemed to me to be useful to start to put it to work, as it were, to ask some of the questions which are the foundations of this conference, which have a lot to do with the nature of what capitalism is about. If you want to see how this works, the best way is to start with the concept of money capital at the bottom of the diagram. What happens is that people take money and turn it into capital by using it in a certain way, and they use it to buy commodities, labor power, means of production. So labor power, means of production is then incorporated in a production process which is designed to do 2 things. One is to make a new commodity, the other is to actually create value and surplus value. The commodity is then sold in the market in some form. It's monetized, transformed from money transformed from commodities into monetary form, or as Marx calls it, it's realized, and so there's a moment of realization. The money is then distributed in various ways between capital and labor, between capital, labor and the state, and also between various factions of capital, such as merchant capital, financiers, landlords, and the like. And then some of that money goes off to actually meet the needs of consumption, and so is used to buy back the commodities which have been produced, and some of the money moves off back into reinvestment. And this is the basic circulation process. And you'll notice that there are three prominent moments in this whole thing. The first is that of production, or as Marx calls it, valorization. The second is the moment of realization in the market. And the third is the moment of distribution of the money in these various forms. And what becomes clear is that Marx actually designed 3 volumes of Capital around each one of these moments. Volume 1 is pretty much all about production. It talks about the formation of money capital. It takes you through the production process into the sale of the commodity, but then it stops. In fact, Marx says, in Volume 1, I make an assumption, which is that all commodities exchange at their value, which says there's absolutely no problem of realization. Marx also says, I assume that the question of distribution does not really affect the total of what I'm looking at, so I'm leaving aside all the questions of distribution. And in doing this, we find that Marx can theorize and develop a theoretical argument about the whole process of production in isolation from the question of realization and the question of distribution. Some of the conclusions that come out of Volume 1 are contingent upon those assumptions. And when you change the assumptions, of course, the conclusions start to look rather different. For instance, the conclusion that everything exchanges at its value means that we don't have to take up the whole kind of question of how value is realized in the consumption side of things. How is it that value, for example, is affected by the state of wants, needs, and desires in a population? How come it's affected by the amount of money which is available from distribution to come back in? In other words, you rule out the whole question of effective demand in Volume 1 of Capital as if effective demand did not matter. Volume 2 of Capital, however, takes up these other questions, but does something very peculiar, which is that it makes technological change actually disappears from the question, and Marx says, I hold it constant, at the same time as he also says, I assume in Volume 2 that all commodities exchange at their value, which is a very strange thing to do given that he's going to look at the market process. But the way he does this is to work back from the equilibrium in which everything is kind of selling at its value, and then ask what are the conditions which would actually sustain that equilibrium. And so this is what he does in Volume 2. But the reason he says that that all commodities exchange at their value in Volumes 1 and Volume 2 is because in Volume 3 he shows that they never exchange at their value. They exchange at something what he called prices of production, which are the prices which arise out of the equalization of the rate of profit rather than the equalization of surplus value production. So that Volume 3 actually goes against Volume 2, and Volume 2 goes against Volume 1, and so you have, as it were, a situation in which Marx's texts are bouncing off each other. And one of the big problems that happens when people read Marx is they often read Volume 1 because it's very easy, it's a great book and it's a fantastic read. Volume 2 is a monumental bore and nobody reads it very much, and so they leave it aside. Volume 3 is very confused and all over the place. And the result is that the totality disappears. And one of the things that seems to me very, very important, and I think for sociologists to think this way, is to reconstruct what the totality is about, and the totality as Marx sees it. And the totality of the accumulation and circulation of capital is really defined by this schema which I've set up here, and then you can look at Volume 2 and say, well, can we complete volume 2 now in a more effective way than Marx can we complete volume 3 in a more effective way. At the same time, Marx mentions many, many times there are circumstances which are, as it were, contexts in which this circulation and accumulation of capital is taking place, and those contexts are terribly important, but, he says, I'm not going to consider them as being basic to the mission of uncovering what the laws of motion of a capitalist system are about. And one of those areas is social reproduction. Marx says we leave question of social reproduction up to the workers, and we leave that all aside, but nevertheless, he is not denying it is important, but he's saying, as far as capital is concerned, it's not concerned with questions of social reproduction. It just says, basically, well, whatever they do, let the workers do what they do. We give them a wage and let them get on with social reproduction and the reproduction of labour power and all the rest of it. So Marx is echoing, as it were, what capital is about when he starts to say questions of social reproduction are one side. Marx himself doesn't think that. Marx is trying to echo back to us the way in which capital works, and it works in such a way as to not care very much about the question of social reproduction, let the rest of the world take care of that. Similarly, there are questions of what Marx calls the free gifts of nature and the free gifts of human nature. The free gifts of nature are, of course, very important. The metabolic relation to nature is foundational. Marx says that in volume 1 of Capital, but he says, I'm not going to study it because the relation to nature is something that's characteristic of all modes of production and doesn't tell you anything specific about capital. And the same is true also of human nature. What kind of human nature matches the circulation of capital and all the rest of it? That is something which is also a free gift. And Marx makes a great deal of the fact that the skill and cultural capacities of the working class and of workers more generally, the issue of culture and so on comes important. And this also becomes important in terms of wants, needs and desires as it affects consumerism and what's going on in the world of consumption. And when you look at this, however, what you realize is that the circulation of capital and the accumulation of capital, which is occurring, has a relation to all of these other contextual conditions. And the relation is very important. And Marx concedes it's important. He just says, I'm not talking about it. And I'm not going to talk about it. And so what we have to do is to recognize what the relationship is between the circulation and accumulation of capital and these contextual conditions. This comes up really very strongly when Marx studies distribution in volume 3. And the distribution questions become really critical, particularly as regards finance and the development of banking and the circulation of interest-bearing capital. And in particular, the creation of fictitious capital in this arena. So what Marx does is to kind of say, look, we need to say something about these relationships, and we have to develop a language in which we can talk about the relations within this overall schema. And the language he uses at each one of these points is to say that it is autonomous and independent, but subsumed within the overall logic of the dynamics of accumulation. Now, this is a very interesting kind of language. It says that the world of production is independent and autonomous of the world of realization, but subsumed within the questions that arise from the standpoint of realization. The same could be said of realization, the same could be said of distribution, but the same can also be said of the relationship to human nature and the relation to nature. And so we end up with actually a whole kind of set of relations going on within this system, which are actually then structured around questions of subjectivities and forms of struggle. And again, what is interesting is to look at anti-capitalist struggles across this map and say, where are these struggles occurring and how different are these struggles depending upon the context in which they occur. The typical Marxist thing by looking at the realm of production is, of course, to concentrate on the class relation, and that becomes absolutely critical in the form of class struggle and how class struggle unfolds, and that is a very, very important piece of this story. But Marx makes it also clear that actually in the Grundrisse and elsewhere that questions of realization are not outside of questions of struggle. And the questions of realization are about the way in which capital affects and tries to negotiate, as it were, with questions of wants, needs, and desires in the market, and how those wants, needs, and desires, and the history of those wants, needs, and desires under capital, how that is all kind of being worked out, and how struggles occur in that area and that in that arena, which are rather different in kind and also in place and space to those which occur in the realm of production. And Marx makes a very important point. He says the struggle in these areas is typically between buyers and sellers, not between capital and labor. Therefore, if there is something going on at the point of realization, such as the increasing land rents and the increasing housing rents in a city, then it's not just simply working class are affected by that, but many people are affected by it, including small business owners, middle class people, and the like. So when you see a situation in Manhattan where a lot of family restaurants are closing down because the rents have doubled every year for about the last 5 years, then you see a situation which is about the realization practices. And those realization practices need to be addressed and fought against and organized against, but the form of organization is radically different from the kind of form of organization that classically and characteristically emerges out of the world of production. The same thing applies to the realm of distribution. The kind of struggles that occur in the realm of distribution are very complex. And who fights them? Who fights against increases in the interest rate? Who fights against the powers of the central banks? Who fights against the power of the Troika and all of the rest of it? There's a world there in which the nature of the struggle takes on a completely different character to the kind of struggle that emerges out of the analysis of production or analysis of realization. Similarly, the struggles over the metabolism of nature and the struggles that occur over social reproduction. These have been very well analysed and talked about effectively by many scholars, feminist ones in particular. The world of social reproduction is a critical arena of discussion where issues arise there which are not to be found, say, elsewhere in this map of the kinds of struggles going on. And right now in the United States, we're having a very interesting discussion about what does it mean to be an American. That is, what is the kind of human nature which attaches to the concept of being an American? Everybody looks at Donald Trump and says, no, I don't want to be like that. But who are we? And I think there's these kinds of debates and questions are very much about the question that was posed about the Europeans. What kind of future do we want? What kind of people do we want to be? And how is that going to be worked out? What kinds of so there's an arena of struggle there, which again has a completely different dynamic. Now, all of these struggles then are mapped all over this system, and they interrelate with each other, but very frequently what we find is that some people kind of are involved in a struggle in this corner of this map kind of look at people elsewhere and say your struggle is unimportant. But Marx's point about this is that all of the moments in this system are equally significant. That you cannot talk about the world of production as if it is isolated from the questions of realization or distribution, or the metabolic relation to nature, or the question of what kind of people we want to be, or what kind of people we become. Those questions cannot be isolated from each other. We have to find a language to be able to work across all of these elements. And as you start to do this, you start to find some very interesting interpretations coming out. Some interpretations which actually I find very intriguing. And in the title to this talk, I mentioned something about a Chinese interpretation, which emerges and actually tells us something very important. The Chinese took the position that the only thing that stabilized global capitalism up until 1971 was the continuous use of the gold standard. And that the gold standard was a critical kind of feature. And if you go back to Marx, you find him saying pretty much the same thing, which is that speculative finance capital in the sphere of distribution tends to take off and as Marx says, it periodically breaks its head against the barrier of the gold standard. But it can never destroy the gold standard, Marx said. It can never do that. And what happens is, therefore, the gold provided some sort of discipline disciplinary apparatus against which all speculative activity could be judged, and which was very significant. This is, by the way, a very wonderful example of this theme worked out in novel form. You read Zola's novel Money, because that's really about the struggle between the House of Rothschild, which was about gold, and the Pereira brothers, who were about speculative finance. And the struggle between them in the Second Empire was huge. Eventually there's a financial crash in 1867, and the Pereira brothers are brought down because they didn't have the gold. Basically people said, well, you've got all of these assets and so on, you've all this paper money, where's the gold behind it? They didn't have the gold. They went to Rothschild and said, lend us the gold, and Rothschild said, no. And they were dead, they were bankrupted. And this is the kind of story that you find. So this is a typical story that prevailed up until 1971. But on 15th of August 1971, there was a delinking of the dollar from gold, the gold standard. It's not actually written about very much, actually, as being as important. One of the few people in the British language who's talked about it was Peter Gowan. And there are some very good accounts, but by and large, most of the analysis leaves this to one side. But the point here is that once you lost the thing of gold, then the whole structure, as far as Marx saw it, was going to be disrupted, because value is a social relation, and therefore it has no measure in itself. But it has to find a measure, and it finds its expression or its representation, as Marx called it, in money. So you have value and you have money. But the relationship is a complicated relationship, and it's a contradictory relation. Because actually it's frequently the case that money lies about value. It's not an accurate representation. And I'm always reminded here, you can do this as a geographer, about map projections. You have map projections that are good in expressing areas, then the directions go completely wonky. If you get the directions right, the areas look terrible. Everything goes. So there are map projections which are good for some things and bad for others. There are forms of money which are good for some things and bad for others. So there are multiple forms of money: fiat monies, coins, money of account, all those kinds of things, which are useful for different purposes. But they all have to come together around one single unique metric, which is gold. When you take that away, then the question of what is money suddenly is opened up. And it's opened up then to all sorts of human manipulations, and the human manipulations can start then to become a basis for some extraordinary practices of accumulation by dispossession. The most famous one being George Soros betting against the position of the pound in the exchange rate mechanism in 1992. I mean, what Soros did was to see that the pound was trading at the bottom of the mechanism. Britain was committed to keeping it within, was spending its foreign exchange reserves to keep the value of the pound within the exchange value mechanism. Soros kind of looked at it and said, okay, this is a kind of one of those asymmetrical bets, which happens, by the way, in the financial services a lot. So an asymmetrical bet, if I bet against the pound and devaluing, then if it devalues, I earn a tremendous amount, possible tremendous amount. If it doesn't devalue, I lose nothing. So it's heads, I win a tremendous amount. Tails, I lose nothing. And with a bet of that kind, Soros kind of said, okay, I'm going to bet against the pound. And he bet against the pound. More and more he bet, of course, the lower the pound went. They couldn't stabilize the pound. They raised the interest rate sort of 4% overnight. Didn't stabilize things. Everything went crazy. And in the end, they had to drop out and the pound gets devalued. Soros then had borrowed all those pounds, which can be converted into Deutschmarks after the pound is devalued. He takes the Deutschmarks, reconverts it back into pounds, and made $1 billion in one night. This is $1 billion in one night, which is made, and this is a form of accumulation, which I could call accumulation by dispossession. It raises the question, who is dispossessed? In this case, it was the British government, or, in other words, the British taxpayer. So, in effect, Soros stole $1 billion from the British taxpayers. Now, there are elements of this kind, and what the Chinese do is to say this kind of thing goes on all of the time. And it goes on all of the time, and it's structured in a certain kind of way. And one of the best examples of this is what happened in Southeast Asia, East and Southeast Asia, in the crisis of 1997-98. Soros and co. started to bet against the Thai baht. And when they bet against that, what happened? They started to force it down like it happened with the pound. And many firms had borrowed money but were indebted in dollars. But when the local baht was declining, they needed more and more baht to cover the dollars, and in the end they couldn't do it. So firms were being driven out of business in Thailand, then it was Indonesia, then it went around, then it went to South Korea, in other words. And it went around because the governments did not have enough foreign exchange reserves to actually do what the Bank of England had been trying to do. But even if they had foreign exchange reserves, they probably wouldn't be able to stop this whole kind of thing. So actually the Chinese look at it and they say, this was a systematic robbery of value from one part of the world by these kinds of mechanisms. It was accumulation by dispossession on a massive scale. Now Marx had a very interesting thing to talk about this, and this is what comes in volume 3. He talks about these sorts of possibilities and very general. Constantly transferring value to those with capital-intensive economies. So this, and he then says, but the interesting thing about these transfers is that they do not go to the people. They go to a certain class. In other words, in the contemporary situation, they go to people like Soros, and they go to people like, they don't go to the working class. So what we've seen is a lot of value transfer going on in the world over the last 30 years. And I hear in Greece talking to you about something that goes on in your backyard all of the time. So this is nothing foreign to you at all. Value transfers are taking place all of the time through these financial mechanisms. And the financial mechanisms are such that it's very hard to stop. Extremely hard to stop, because there's no gold barrier. And the only barrier is going to be human institutions. And the human institutions, as you well know here in Greece, are stacked. Stacked to favor, guess who? Those with capital-intensive economies. And so the whole thing is kind of set up in a certain kind of way. And the Chinese came up with a very interesting calculation. They kind of said their view was that as far as they could tell, 2/3 of the US GDP was based on value transfers from the rest of the world. And only 1/3 of it was actually coming from manufacturing. China's the other way around. And they kind of said, one of the reasons why we're constantly being lectured about, currency being currency manipulators, open our capital markets, all this kind of stuff, and there's constant going on about the unfairness of the Chinese say, we are not opening ourselves up. Because if we open ourselves up, we are going to be raided and robbed, as happened in Southeast and Southeast Asia, and if you go back in time, as happened to Mexico in 1982 and happened in the developing world debt crisis through the 1980s. In fact, what capital is about these days is not necessarily creating value through making things, but it's more and more about stealing value by robbing people of value by these mechanisms. And this has everything to do, say the Chinese, because of the abandonment of the gold standard. Some of this was going on, of course, way back, when the gold standard was in operation, but there was a barrier to it. There was a limit to it. It was not as if there were no financial crises or no sort of transfers of value going on. No, indeed, they were going on. But since 1971, these value transfers are going on at a very hefty and very rapid rate. And they're actually set up so that they happen as part of the laws of motion of capital. And it's very interesting to see how capitalist thinkers deal with this. Stiglitz, in his book on globalization and its discontents, says, there is a story in East and Southeast Asia which says perfectly good firms were forced out of business by these strategies of, you know, hedge funds and all the rest of it, betting against the currencies and the difficulty of covering dollar-denominated debts and so on, and that when the companies were forced into bankruptcy, then the financial institutions went in and bought them up, and then waited for a little bit, and then when conditions revived, then they sold them back at a huge profit, like Soros did. So people made mega bucks. And so Stiglitz kind of actually gives a very good account of this, and then says, you know, this is a typical conspiracy theory that comes from the left. And you kind of go, yeah, but actually the Chinese believe this and know that this is the case. And what's more, you're not going to get the Chinese to open up their, you know, particularly their capital flows to capital flows. They're not going to do it because they say basically as soon as we do that, we're the next one in line to be robbed, and we're not going to be robbed. And this big battle that's about to emerge between Trump and the Chinese is, I think, going to be extremely interesting along those lines. But the point here is that the Chinese have understood Marx in a certain kind of way about the significance of the gold standard and what happens when the gold standard gets abandoned, and have come up with, as it were, a theory of accumulation by dispossession on a global scale, which is saying essentially they are not going to be dispossessed. And what this does is to say, look at what you're doing and recognize that all of this glorious utopian idea of what happens when things become open markets that consistently comes out of Marx, no matter whether you're in volume 1, volume 2, or volume 3, which is that free market economics is about the creation of inequality and the robbery of value from one class to another class, and that often implies the robbery of value from one part of the world to another. So these are the kinds of issues that arise when you look at this kind of systemically and what's going on in here. And this is the kind of thing I found myself when I look at this and I start step by step going through saying, what are the nature of the struggles that occur in the world, and how can those struggles become unified as anti-capitalist struggles? How can we actually start to rethink the broad relation between the accumulation of capital and the creation of a human personality, and in much the same way that Gramsci talked about the creation of the Fordist worker. In effect, what neoliberalism was about was to create a creation of an alternative kind of personality, the kind of personality that's been described being actually imposed upon universities by, you know, research assessment exercises and the Bologna Accord and all the rest of it. So these are the kinds of questions which it seems to me that come out of an attempt to look at the totality of what it was that Marx had in mind. And that looking at that totality requires that we pay careful attention to the relationships between volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Capital, but also pay close attention to the contextual conditions, the metabolic relation to nature, the questions of social reproduction, the questions of the production of culture and the destruction of culture, and the emergence of ideologies and the like, so that we could have a much better understanding of the totality if we would only get back to accepting the idea that totalities are not a bad thing to think about and look at. And we've been through a number of years now where actually totality is a bad word, and you shouldn't do it. You're obviously insane or pathological if you use such terms. But what is great about looking at Marx from this kind of the perspective of his totality is that you get a notion of how the accumulation of capital works, how the structure of capital works, and with that, armed with that, you can discover and understand all sorts of dynamics. And if I had times, I could go around a lot of this, and what I did in the book was to talk about all the kinds of implications that this kind of understanding has. So thank you.
So thanks a lot, David. We directly hand over to Eva and her talk with the title Evaluation, Valuation and Devaluation, Sexuality and the Techno-Capitalist Self.
I'd like to start by thanking very much the ESA organizers, not only for inviting me to these very distinguished meetings, but also for inviting me to think with others here about the crisis of capitalism. Let me start then. Feminist scholar Alice Eccles has defined the main goal of second wave feminism as that of offering strategies to counter, I quote, the cultural valuation of the male and the devaluation of the female, end of quote. This is, I think, a far more ambitious and elusive program than that of fighting for equality, for while equality is measurable, quantifiable, and enforceable, often through courts, devaluation evades scrutiny, is often psychologized and privatized, and is in fact a deeply confused aspect of women's experience and subjectivity. The question I've been working on for the past few years is this: what are the mechanisms explaining that while women have acquired some status or more status in the economic, legal, and political spheres, they have undergone a serious devaluation in the sexual, romantic spheres? A psychologist who advertises her services on the internet, she advertises and she sells what she calls a dating rehab program. This program is geared to women and describes, without naming it by its proper name, such experience of devaluation. I quote her. She says, dating today is broken and the proof is in the symptoms. See if you've experienced any of these. You meet someone who seems very interested, but then his ardor for you rapidly vanishes, and he exits your life as quickly as he entered. You fear getting your hopes up because you don't want to be let down again. You'll click with someone at a party, and you can feel there is chemistry, but then he never makes a move. You're left wondering if you misread his signals, or maybe later you find out that he's actually seeing someone. Why then was he flirting with you? And how can you trust anyone, let alone your instincts? I've seen this, she says. I've seen this happen with such alarming frequency with my single clients that I knew dating today wasn't working. It had devolved into a haphazard system that was woefully inept at creating connection, end of quote. What this psychologist who sells her dating rehab program refers to, again, without properly naming it, because for psychologists, relationships are a matter of correct self-management, what she's referring to are experiences of devaluation, in which two people negotiate an interaction which elicits uncertainty in women about their own worth and possibly about another's worth. So I'm going to claim against psychological conventional wisdom that we should explain these processes of devaluation sociologically. And two processes explain how devaluation has become such a routine experience of women encountering men in what's called the dating market: valuation and evaluation. These two processes, I will claim, are at the heart of women's subjectivity. Valuation is the process of generating worth through economic and symbolic mechanisms. For example, exhibiting one's worth in one's artwork in a national museum increases the economic worth of one's art. As David Harvey has said, value is a social relationship. It's a social mechanism. It is not intrinsic. Evaluation is the activity of appraising, comparing, and measuring the worth of an object. Evaluation and valuation are often concomitant social processes. For example, the art collector or credit rating agency engage at once in evaluation and valuation. Devaluation is the process of lowering worth through symbolic and/or economic mechanisms, such as the speech act of a powerful economic actor who will express a lack of trust in a currency, like Soros, or through economic mechanisms such as overproduction, as when a commodity is in higher supply than demand. These three processes mark qualitatively a new way of forming and unforming intimate, sexual, romantic relationships, and they are mediated by the consumer market, internet technology, and media industries. Let me start with valuation then, and what I mean. As social psychologist Roy Boymaster and feminist scholar Paola Tabet have argued, in all societies where women are deprived of social and economic power, they trade their sexuality with men's power, what Paola Tabet has called the heterosexual bargain. In such societies, women, or the men who control the women, exchange sexual services for different prices, usually a long courtship and marriage, but it could be also gifts or money, as in prostitution. But after the 1970s and in the consumer economy after the 1970s, two important changes happened. Thanks to the contraceptive pill and the normative change brought about by the sexual revolution, sexual access to women became unrestricted, demanding very low costs from men, certainly not marriage and courtship, as is exemplified in the practice of casual sex. And the second change is that women's body became the source of a formidable economic value, which benefited mostly, but not exclusively, men. Women's bodies started producing immense economic value for men. At the same time, sexuality became accessible, women's body became sexualized, and once sexualized, it generated a surplus value which circulated in the capitalist economy under the form of the image of the sexually attractive body of the woman. The transformation of the body into an image started with the emergence of the culture industries and with the mass marketization of fashion and cosmetics industries around the 1920s. These industries turned the female body into a visual unit, relentlessly fashioned through media icons and through the industries of fashion, cosmetics, sports, and dieting. Women turned their body into a visual unit through a process in which media icons and fashion industries seamlessly collaborated to promote new modes of self-presentation. As cultural historian Warren Sussman puts it, procedures of self-production and self-presentation have always reflected the dominant cultural and economic interests of the time. These interests were made visible in a body which performed sexuality and consumer purchase in one. Take the example of the notion of sexiness, which emerged in the 1960s as a new concept to fashion the body and the self. Sexiness was more directly defined by looks and style, and thus it was more directly dependent on consumer goods. And it was far more democratic than beauty, and thus it actually appealed to much more consumers. As Guy Debord famously put it, the society of spectacle is not a mere collection of images, but rather it is a social relationship between images, mediated by images. And I think this is nowhere more true. He did not speak about it, but I think this is nowhere more true as in the heterosexual interaction, which is the encounter of two sexy bodies self-fashioned as images of attractive bodies. As a woman who defines herself as a sugar baby, blogger puts it, referring to the attention she puts in her body in order to catch the attention of a rich old man, she says, could I really be happy with a man old enough to be my father? Yes, yes, and yes. I love coordinating my outfits, getting manicures, pedicures, and especially shopping. I love all these things with or without the benefit of meeting rich men, preferably with. The woman you see walking down the street is a piece of art. A lot of maintenance, manicures, pedicures, haircuts, waxing, bleaching, plucking, and shopping goes into that piece of art. Art reflects your lifestyle and status. If a trophy is what you want, then you must be prepared to pay, end of quote. As this self-defined sugar baby puts it, the capacity to look beautiful and to attract a man requires a preliminary intensive work of self-fashioning, intricately dependent on and mediated by the consumer sphere. These expenditures are a form of self-investment which increase her sexual value, which also increases her capacity not only to find a husband, but I will argue now also to act as an economic actor. Indeed, the sexy body is at once economic and sexual. While traditionally women's sexuality was directly exchanged for men's power, as is the case for this sugar baby, in consumer capitalism, female sexuality has become an image redirected to the market, and it is as an image that it generates tremendous amount of capital in various forms. One form of such capital is the plethora of service industries which require a pleasant or attractive appearance. Restaurant hosts, flight attendants, public relations, all jobs in which the interface between a company and the consumers occurs through an attractive representative, what Catherine Hakim has very controversially called erotic capital. In that sense, sexuality belongs to immaterial labor, the set of intangible skills and competencies actors bring to the workplace. I quote a sociologist, increasingly companies are seeking employees who embody the right look. Another way to say this is that capitalist corporations do not extract surplus values from the muscular body of men working in coal pits, but from the groomed and aestheticized body of women. A second way in which sexual images produce value is through the vast gamut of cultural industries in which sex and sexuality are consumed as an image. These industries range from various pornographic circuits to movies, to advertising, to cinema, to TV industries, which all produce the spectacle of a sexualized body geared to the consumer's gaze. Movies will gross. It's known that movies will gross more money, usually if actors are beautiful and if they contain sex scenes. It is noteworthy that women's body is traded as a visual commodity in a market that is mostly controlled by men. Visual industries as movies, fashion photography, pornography, TV networks, advertising agencies, etc. are overwhelmingly owned and managed by men. Pornography, for example, the most blatantly commodified industry of women's body as a visual unit, is predominantly male, both on the production and consumption side. Ironically, once it became an image, women's body's sexuality generated unprecedented gains for men, turning, if you want, the heterosexual bargain around. A third form of value generated by sexuality is to be found in the vast therapeutic industry of sexual advice, which includes women's magazines, self-help culture, self-help literature, and sexual psychological consultations of all persuasions. This industry is chiefly geared to women who are enjoined to acquire sexual competence for men's pleasure. Here, economic value is produced by positing women as consumers and performers of sexual competence, how to achieve orgasm, how to rekindle your sexuality, etc. Finally, the image of the sexy body can be converted into a capital in the increasingly expanding market of short-term and long-term sexual transactions, a market that has intensified and become formalized with internet technologies. This exchange takes multiple forms, such as casual hookups, short-term or long-term dating, living together, and marriage. So women's sexual capital, their attractiveness, functions as a fungible commodity, which can be invested in multiple micro markets. A YouTube beauty vlog where L'Oreal will advertise, a pornographic movie, a job as a company representative, but also in a sexual market to find a husband, a rich husband, a sugar daddy who will pay for Prada bags, a boyfriend who will go to movies with, etc. All of these suggest that, contrary to the view sometimes presented by historians, that capitalism has transformed the private sphere into a sphere saturated with emotions, on the contrary, heterosexuality has become deeply immersed in the economy, and especially in what some have dubbed aesthetic capitalism. Sexual identity has become increasingly inscribed in the capitalist aestheticization of everyday experience, and women's body have become visual commodities consumed for the male gaze. Thus, we may say that a large portion of capitalist economy is based on a scopic regime of production of surplus value through a woman's sexualized body, and that the gaze is an essential aspect of this aesthetic extraction of surplus value from the body. While feminist theory has crucially illuminated the non-paid work of women in the formation of the capitalist engine, we must emphasize here that consumer capitalism has generated and continues to generate a tremendous surplus value from the sexualization of women's body, their transformation into aesthetic images, which in turn transform the terms of heterosexual encounters. What Hegel, Axel Honneth, Nancy Fraser, and Jessica Benjamin have called recognition, that is the intersubjective process of two subjectivities meeting and acknowledging each other, has moved here to a visual and sexual plane, recognizing and being recognized by others as sexual and visual surfaces. Let me move to the rest of my presentation is shorter, to the second part, which is evaluation. So the scopic regime of sexual interaction entails a new cognitive orientation of actors that is antecedent to recognition, to what Honneth and Fraser call recognition, and even undermines it. I call this antecedent cognitive orientation evaluation. Evaluation and recognition are two different moral and cognitive postures. Sexual actors increasingly engage in evaluation, and my claim now is going to be that evaluation undermines recognition. Evaluation has been increasingly viewed as a crucial feature of modern interactions, primarily in the education system and in corporations. Boltanski, Eve Chapeliot, Michel Lamont, and others have extensively written about this. Evaluation is a feature of bureaucratic organizations concerned with performance and productivity. Less discussed, perhaps, is the prominent role which visual evaluation has come to occupy in heterosexual interactions regulated by scopic markets. Visual evaluation has a number of features. It is snap and instantaneous. The gaze typically apprehends and evaluates an object visually in a matter of split seconds or seconds. As cognitive psychologists put it, a visual evaluation is a type of cognition that is fast and frugal. It relies on and needs very little information to form a preference towards an object. Because of the speed of visual evaluation, actors will tend to look for and privilege conventional features of attractiveness as they are codified by media images and fashion industries. It's cleavage, narrow waist, long legs, blonde hair, fair and smooth skin, thinness, etc., thus creating a hierarchy in which standardized looks are privileged over non-standardized looks. The speed of visual evaluation also makes sexual evaluation a relatively non-interactional, one-sided feature of social interactions, contrary to personality or emotional evaluation, which is usually established after a linguistic exchange. Visual evaluation can in principle take place without interaction and is typically one-sided. A third feature of visual evaluation connected to the speed of valuation is that the visualization of relationship transforms the attribution of worth into a binary process. A woman is either hot or not, attractive or unattractive. It is these attributes of visual evaluation, speed, one-sidedness, and binarity, which have become institutionalized in applications like Tinder, who are today used by more than 100 million people worldwide, whose main innovation was precisely the swipe left and swipe right. And this innovation actually deepens and formalizes the logic of visual evaluation. It is quick, binary, and one-sided. This entails a fourth attribute of visual evaluation as formalized by internet technology. Its high speed enables a much higher volume of interactions, with men and women being typically in touch with a dozen partners a week, and I'm modest, it's actually often much more. I will now argue that visual evaluation is antinomic with recognition because it contains built-in mechanisms of devaluation. This is my third part. In critical feminist theory, sexualization entails a lessening of women's worth through the notion of objectification, being the object of the man's gaze. But this view, I think, does not help us understand why so many women enthusiastically participate in their own objectification and even feel empowered by it, as the sugar baby I quoted before suggests. In fact, as this sugar baby suggests, many women embrace enthusiastically their status as sexual object, take great pleasure in shaping their body for the gaze of men, and experience themselves as full subjects through their capacity to build an objectified and sexualized image of themselves. We have to understand this if we want to understand capitalist subjectivity. I think that female subjectivity espouses readily its own objectification because in an increasingly scopic market, their objectification can be converted in an economic asset, which itself can be converted to a sexual advantage in the sexual market. In other words, I differ slightly from the conventional feminist explanation by saying that this sexual objectification has actually has the illusion of, or can be converted into an economic asset. In traditional societies, encounters were regulated by social institutions as families, communities, or geographical proximity. They usually occurred horizontally, that is, between people of similar class or religion, and marriage was a one-time and life-determining economic event, which was independent, if you want, on the real market of economic exchange. Scopic markets change all this because sexual encounters take place in and through the consumer market, and they take themselves the form of a market. They become themselves a market in which everybody competes with everybody. It's not horizontal anymore. And they compete with everybody, and the encounters take place directly with no regulating agencies. So sexual markets are governed by the law of supply and demand and are iterative. It is this market form, controlled by men, which then generates the devaluation of women. How then does such devaluation happen in a market mediated by scopic regimes of evaluation? One aspect of visual evaluation is that it is typically unreliable. As a variety of research has shown, the opinion that is formed on the basis of visual attractiveness and visual cues can easily change when there is a prolonged attention to the object. People wearing glasses, for example, are deemed more intelligent than others when they are looked at for 15 seconds. But when they are looked at for a longer time, the difference disappears. So visual evaluation makes others highly and quickly susceptible to being disposable in our evaluative system. Second, because of its binary character, visual evaluation entails and implies almost by definition a readiness to dismiss others. As in the consumer realm, taste and choice reflect subjects' preferences as much as his known choices. And in Tinder, for example, swiping left which was, as I said, the main innovation of Tinder, actually is an act of disliking, of saying, I don't like, of dismissing. 3, visual evaluation implicitly privileges consumer objects as signals of another's attractiveness, and thus create an implicit equivalence between objects and persons. Sexual attractiveness is induced by consumer items and is easily shaken by the wrong look or appearance, as sexual attraction depends on the alignment of real persons with media-induced icons, images, and commodities, thus creating vast pools of unworthy and unattractive persons. Fourth, the entire economy of attractiveness relies on the constant renewal of looks and on youth as a central commodity and as a model of attractiveness, thus creating built-in mechanisms of obsolescence, women quickly ceasing to be tradable commodities in economic and sexual markets. This is blatant, for example, in the fashion industry, in which models older than 23 are considered too old. And this is also true in the vast industries of cinema, advertising, or TV. Inherent obsolescence is equally present in sexual markets, where young women have a much higher status than older ones and actually play the role of status symbols of rich men. See Donald Trump or see his aide Steve Mnuchin. The built-in obsolescence of looks thus creates quick disposability of persons. The visual evaluation that regulates scopic markets thus must be thought of as a mechanism to create quick disposability of others, and especially women. My final point is no less important. This economy of sexual abundance created by these scopic markets undermines the very capacity to attribute worth and value, in fact. Research, again, in cognitive psychology shows the impact of abundance on the capacity to establish the worth of an object. Christopher Hesse and Jiao Zhang, two psychologists at the University of Chicago, suggest that the process of evaluation changes whether one considers different options or whether one is immersed in a single experience. In other words, the first example is the supermarket, the second is the auction house. The supermarket they call the joint evaluation mode, whereas the second is what they call the single evaluation mode. In the joint supermarket evaluation mode, people can compare the attributes, pay attention to differences between various objects. And in the single evaluation mode, on the other hand, people evaluate the object by referring to what they like or think is beautiful in an object that stands alone, as is the case for a purchase in an auction house. So clearly the joint evaluation mode is the one where people make comparisons, think about trade-offs, what they stand to lose or to gain if they make a specific choice, while in the single evaluation mode, people are able to commit to an object because they're not comparing it to anything else. So, and actually what they find typically and unsurprisingly is that people will typically pay much more for an object that is in a single evaluation mode than if it is in a joint evaluation mode. But this also means that we simply do not know how to evaluate the worth of an object when we are in a market situation and when we compare it to others. As sociologist Ashley Mears insightfully put it with regard to the modeling industry, in many cultural areas, the price or worth of a model, work of art, or an actor is unclear. The problem of pricing exemplifies a larger quandary faced by cultural producers, and for that matter, people in any market of intangibles. It is the problem of uncertainty, the inability to state in advance what one wants, and thus the ability of assigning worth to an object. So pre-modern romantic evaluators chose as if in an auction house because they operated in conditions of scarcity and regulation. Modern sexual and romantic evaluators choose as if in a supermarket and thus lack a clear reference point to attribute worth. Because sexual actors meet in a market situation, these actors face what we may call emotional deflation, much like economic mechanisms of deflation. The fact that the overall price or worth of goods falls either because of competition or because of greater efficiency, which diminish the costs of producing goods. I would argue that sexual freedom, the contraceptive pill, the transformation of women's body into a sexual image for the profit of men, the internet technology, can all be said to be mechanisms that have increased sexual abundance, have made men's access to female sexual partners more efficient, has lowered the cost of sexual interactions for men, has generated tremendous economic surplus value for men, and have had the consequence of either diminishing the value of a woman's body or making it worthless in sexual markets. That is, an object to which it is difficult to attribute a worth. As David Harvey insightfully put it, mass devaluation of commodities, of hitherto productive plant and equipment, of money and of labor, are endemic to capitalism. Devaluation is intrinsic to capitalism, since this is what enables the circulation and the creation of new value needed for consumer markets, end of quote. Thus, the fact that sexual encounters have now a market form and are shaped by economic scopic markets creates, I think, a difficulty to establish worth and to keep stable one's value. It is this market form of sexual markets which creates devaluation and ontological uncertainty, that is, an uncertainty about the very locus of self-worth and worth. Women feel alternatively subject and object. They feel empowered and disempowered in a permanent threat of obsolescence. And they feel often as an object whose worth cannot be evaluated and who thus cannot be engaged in a process of recognition. In his Tanner lecture, Axel Honneth claims that reification, a Marxist concept, is a complex interplay between recognition and cognition. He asks how cognition can lead antecedent recognition, that is what precedes recognition, to be forgotten. I believe that sexual markets that I've described here offer a good example of such forgetting. Honneth very helpfully speaks of low attentiveness to explain how this act of recognition can be forgotten. Low attentiveness paradoxically occurs in a society where attention is regulated by visuality, where visual objects exist in abundance, where subjects approach each other in a market situation, where there exists a mechanism that makes persons and bodies interchangeable and tradable. Quoting Honneth, we may speak here of a perceptual reification. I quote him, "Our social surroundings appear here very much as in the autistic child's worlds of perception as a totality of merely observable objects lacking all psychic impulse or emotion." I believe these are the conditions where subjects are emptied of emotions and psychic impulse, and they are realized in scopic markets, at once economic and sexual. And I will end with a quote. I will end with an alternative model of sexual and visual evaluation. I will quote here Vita Sackville-West, the woman aristocrat who passionately fell in love with Virginia Woolf. I quote her. She says about Virginia, "She's utterly unaffected. There are no outward adornments. She dresses quite atrociously. At first you think she's plain, then a sort of spiritual beauty imposes itself on you, and you find a fascination in watching her." End of quote. This visual evaluation does not take place in a market of many possible others. It is non-binary. It sees what is atrocious and what is compelling in a single gaze. Consumer objects play no role in determining how attractive Virginia is. She dresses atrociously. The evaluation is not a snap judgment and in fact evolves with time and does not start off a process of disposability. In fact, it morphs into a process of recognition, what she called her spirituality. It does not gaze at a body situated in a market of competing attractive bodies, but rather identifies a singularity. Valuation as the process of creating subjective and economic value in economic and sexual scopic markets produce for the gaze an evaluation of others, thus explain the process of devaluation of women, a process that takes place within the very process of forming scopic value. Valuation and evaluation are at the heart of such devaluation. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I think I want to briefly put it in perspective. So I have three takeaways from both lectures. First, the critical analysis of capitalism is really crucial for sociology. Second, we can learn from both talks that capitalism is a dynamic, contradictory system. And third, we can learn that these contradictions seem to take place as a dialectic of valorization and devalorization that take place, as David was showing, on the level of the totality of capitalism, and as Eva was showing, at the level of the subject, the self, and sexuality. And I think what David is in generally showing in his work is that neoliberalism as a form of accumulation by dispossession and financialized capitalism in the form of fictitious capital debt and other forms of anti-value creates crisis. And I think what Eva's work is showing is that emotional capitalism means the production and manipulation of emotional experiences, the creation of fictional emotions, and as she called it, sexual and aesthetic capital. So now I think I want to ask both of you like one question. I think what is happening in capitalism today is the emergence of what some people would maybe call authoritarian capitalism. And what is prototypical for it, or what's the prototype for it, is Donald Trump. Yeah? And if you think of Donald Trump, I think it speaks to both of your work somehow. Yeah? Donald Trump became so rich by being a real estate capitalist, yeah? Which has to do a lot with the way urban space has been reconfigured, commodified, and things David has worked on. On the other hand, he's a sexist, self-branding machine, speaking a lot of to issues of emotional capitalism that Eva has talked to. So what I'm wondering now is, when this person becomes US president, what does it mean for capitalism, for US capitalism, for global capitalism? Are we entering a new phase of capitalism? Is this still neoliberal capitalism, financialized capitalism, emotional capitalism, or is it a new stage? Is Donald Trump an emotional capitalist? Is he a neoliberal capitalist? How should we understand the phenomenon like Trump? What do you think, David?
Well, I have no idea how to... I will say this, that in working on a brief history of neoliberalism some years ago, it seemed to me that the neoliberal economic project could not be sustained without the emergence of a rather authoritarian state apparatus, which would not retire politically from social life, but would actually make sure that the neoliberal ethic was kept in place. At the time I was writing that, we still had a movement in the United States of neoconservatism, and the neoconservatives was very much in favor of the Iraq war. The neocons, as we called them, were essentially about a strategy of global domination. So that I think that the instability of the neoliberal project, and in particular the devaluation of whole populations, and was which Eva has been talking about from the gender perspective, creates a situation of mass alienation. And I tend to go to the idea of alienation, alienation from labor, alienation from the stresses of daily life, alienation from political processes, alienation from relations to nature and things of that kind, so that in a situation of mass alienation, you don't necessarily get a turn to the left, you can just as easily get instability of the political process. And when you look, I think in some ways Trump is an aberration, a peculiar product of how US politics works. I think it would be more important to look at some of the things going on in Europe, Hungary, for example, and the whole kind of question of right-wing populism, and is there a left-wing populism that can counter the right-wing populism, which seems to me to be the sort of issue that has been arising here in this country with Podemos in Spain and the like. But Trump is a phenomena beyond, it seems to me, any easy kind of analysis. And I think what is scary about it is that we really have no idea exactly what he's going to do. And I think the Republican establishment doesn't know what he's going to do. His own staff don't know what he's going to do. And having a person like that in charge of the nuclear exchange button with North Korea, it gets me extremely scared in terms of what might happen. My own feeling is that I don't think actually Trump is going to stay president for very long. That at a certain point, I think that the Republican establishment is going to have to say we can't run with this anymore, and they will find a way to impeach him and get rid of him, which is not to say that the current Vice President, Mike Pence, is a nice person and a great improvement. In fact, the big problem with Mike Pence is that you know what he's going to do, and it is not nice at all. So politics in the United States is really, if I can use a colloquial term, it's really fucked.
If I also want to ask you, like, is Trump an emotional capitalist? Yeah, and what does it mean that we are experiencing the Trumpification of politics, of society? What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, I was already. I was with the other question. Don't know about the Trumpification of society. Let me try to connect Trump to my talk, although it's not extremely connected. Trump was extraordinarily sexist. He denigrated, mocked women for their appearance, for being overweight. He mocked a Republican women contender for her face, saying who would vote for her face. He related to his own daughter, saying that she met enough criteria of beauty that he would date her. Actually, if she was not his own daughter. So I personally don't remember or don't know in my lifetime of a public figure who was so straightforwardly, who so straightforwardly, who embodied the idea that the worth of a woman exists only in her beauty and physical appearance. I don't know anybody officially who has done it like that. With that, we know that 53% of the white women's vote went to Trump. And they quoted his business capacities as a good reason for voting for him. Now, I think that all of us would agree that if a candidate was to have overtly anti-Semitic or overtly racist, anti-black words, it's very difficult to imagine that 53% of the Jewish community or of the African American community would have voted for this man. And yet, 53% of women voted for him. That's an extraordinary result, in my opinion, which really goes to the heart, I think, of the conundrum and the difficulty of women's subjectivity, which is indirectly connected to the topic of my talk, which is that women have deeply internalized their widespread objectification by media culture and by an authoritarian political figure like Trump. So this, I think, is really the question that would interpellate me in this context.
Yes, thank you both. We don't have time for audience questions, but David and Eva will be around for the reception later, so please talk to them also. I will hand back to Apostolos now. We will continue, but let's thank David and Eva for two illuminating talks. Thank you.
Hello. This is the program. We are a little behind of the program, but we will catch up. We thank the two speakers, and now we have a concert program, and this is a good occasion for everyone to know that there isn't only Greek philosophy, but there is also Greek music. And this concert delivered by the Athens State Orchestra Brass and Percussion Ensemble. It's called Metalon. Will take their position in a moment under the directorship of Nikolaos Chaliasas, who is the director, and they will play a number of music pieces from Greek composers and from non-Greek composers. I'm waiting. Let's allow some seconds for the Athens State Orchestra to come into and take their places, okay?
Thank you.